All right. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Max Skelton, the director of the Institute of Regional and International Studies, which is based at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. I've been in touch with many of you over the past few months to plan for the Suleimani Forum, which of course we couldn't hold this year due to COVID. Nonetheless, our team of scholars, researchers, and students at IRIS have continued with our projects and publications, and this is only possible through the support of donor institutions and countries, many of whom are on the line today. We thank you for your ongoing support. Thanks as well to our IRIS and AUIS staff, especially Siobhan Najm Abdullah, Deloitte Mefson, and Ranj Aladdin, who have facilitated this webinar. We're very grateful. Today's focus is on the oil and gas sector. We have really too much to cover, and so we're going to go ahead and turn to our panelists. We have with us Alia Safar, who covers energy markets with a focus on the Middle East for the International Energy Agency. We also have Samia Kulab, who is the Iraq correspondent for the Associated Press. And Samia was also, as many of you know, with Iraq Oil Report. And finally, we have our very own Ahmed Tabakshali, Senior Fellow at IRIS. We're going to begin with a question and opening remarks for each panelist. And then we're going to have a kind of a back and forth between the panelists themselves. And finally, some Q&A. You can submit your questions to us just at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the Q&A link. So, Ali, we're going to turn to you first. Could you help us understand the volatility in energy markets and the specific issues this raises for Iraq? And with that, what are the kind of long-term implications of this current uncertainty we are seeing both on the demand and supply side for Iraq?
Thank you very much, Mac, and good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Institute for inviting me alongside my two friends, Ahmed, who I learn a lot from, and Samia, who's reporting I rely on for most of my daily job. So thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. The questions you raise are really excellent ones. And this is a time of pretty exceptional volatility. And if I might, I'm probably best, it's probably best that I share my screen to show you some of the dynamics at play and talk through them on both the supply and demand side, because we're hearing a lot. It's on the news most days about what's happening in the oil markets, but I want to show how this time is slightly different to previous times in terms of the volatility that we're facing. So since the start of the year, you can see my screen, I'm guessing, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, since the start of the year, we've seen a situation where oil prices have lost about 2/3 of their value. Now, obviously, they've gone up and gone down in that time, but the trajectory has been mostly downwards. Now, this chart I created on Friday, and already today it's looking horribly outdated, because if you look at what's happening in the markets today, both for Brent and for West Texas Intermediate, so WTI, you've seen a significant downward spiral just today. So even this is slightly outdated, but essentially the start happened at the new year when the first COVID cases started to be detected, and then Wuhan shut down. Now, obviously, since then it's spread across the world. The pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization. Then there was the OPEC meeting. But this is very much a story that has two parts. The first is that there's been a big demand side shock, where obviously you had countries like dominoes calling quarantines into place, and right now it's estimated that between 3.5 and 4 billion people are confined to their homes. So of course, those are all people who are not taking flights, not taking, not driving around. Big shock to the demand side on the oil. But of course, there was this OPEC Plus meeting in early March, in which some of these dynamics started to be questioned. There was a call for a greater reduction by producers. There was a disagreement, and that led to a supply shock to exacerbate the already large overhang in the markets. And so you had significant increase in downward pressure. Now, most of this is a demand side shock, but of course there was an exacerbation by the supply side. Since then, it's basically been in a free fall. Last week on Friday, so 2 Fridays back, there was a meeting of the G20 ministers and a few other countries that followed another OPEC plus meeting, in which producers, conventional producers of OPEC plus Russia plus Mexico, and kind of the new world producers, so the US, Canada, and Brazil, got together in two separate organizations and said, okay, we're going to have to do something on the supply side, and essentially said, on the OPEC side, said that we're going to reduce our production by around 10 million barrels a day. At the G20, the US, Canada, and Brazil said that just by virtue of the fact that we have capital expenditure restrictions or confined capital expenditure in our sectors, we're going to expect a quite significant fall in oil demand. We're also going to use our strategic petroleum reserves to hold oil that doesn't go to the market, and so that should support it. Now, the thing is with that, even after that meeting, prices were in free fall. And that's essentially a story of the demand side shock being absolutely unlike anything we've ever seen. And that's what this chart shows. So if you look at what's happening in April and in May, what we're expecting to see in April and May, in April, we're expecting year-on-year declines in oil demand to reach 29 million barrels. Essentially what this does is it wipes out so much of the growth that we've seen over the last decades. And it effectively means that this is the steepest decline, monthly decline, that the world has ever seen in oil demand. What does the recovery look like? This is incumbent on what happens with the virus. So, this is predicated on some assumptions on what the global recovery looks like, in a metaphorical sense and a literal sense, health recoveries. But essentially, if the world starts to open up in May, then the decline in demand in May reaches around 25 million barrels a day, year on year, and then the recovery picks up. But if you take it on an annualized basis, oil demand this year is essentially 9 million barrels a day less than it was last year. So a decade of oil demand growth has been wiped out in 1 year. Now, what the deal does, what the deals, the G20 and the OPEC plus deals do, they're not supposed to address the immediate issue. The demand side destruction is so great that nothing you do on the supply side can remedy the overhang. But what they're supposed to do is further down along the line, further down the year when demand starts to recover, it's supposed to address some of the overhang. And so in the second half of the year, we're expecting, if this recovery takes shape, that there will be a stock reduction rather than a stock build, which is what we're seeing in the first half of the year. And then that can start to remedy some of the fundamentals. But essentially what we're left with right now is extremely low oil prices. The last I checked, it was reaching $27 a barrel for Brent. And we modeled some of the impacts of this on several oil producers, what we call producer economy. For Iraq, we found that net oil revenue, in other words, rent, decreases by around 70% this year compared to last. Now, I want to raise two things. The first is that this is modeled on a Brent price of 30. Now, Brent is now at 27. Iraq also sells at a discount to Brent. And so that red bar that you see on your screens right now is a little bit higher than maybe it will end up being. The second thing is this is modeled on the pre-OPEC plus cut, because the cut hasn't been seen yet. So again, there's significant downside risk to what we're showing. What this this is a significant cut. It means that Iraq won't be able to honor most of its budgetary requirement, and that's a problem because if you look at what's happened, you can learn a lot from history, and you don't even have to go that far back to learn, because the last price cycle happened in 2014, and what we saw is this situation where you get constrained spending. Now, the way that the Iraqi budget works is that when prices have trended higher, oil prices have trended higher, the government has usually responded to that by increasing spending. And most of that increase in spending tends to happen for current expenditure. In other words, for salaries, for pensions, for entitlements. So between 2009 and 2013, that chunk grew by about half. And now, of course, given the fact that when you're paying salaries, either you're increasing salaries or increasing the number of people on the payroll, when oil prices fall, as they inevitably do, it's impossible or very, very difficult politically to then either reduce salaries or take people off the payroll by sacking them. And so what happens is that if you largely have these two chunks of spending, capital expenditure, which is salaries and pensions, and on the other side, you've got capital expenditure, which is things like building hospitals, building schools, building roads, building power plants, then what tends to happen is that the salaries are sticky, but the capital expenditure is not. And so the biggest reductions happen in the capital expenditure. And believe it or not, even in 2019, which was an expansionary budget passed at a time of relatively high oil prices, the size of the budget was still around 1/5 lower than it reached in 2013. So what I'm saying here is that we have a counter-cyclical fiscal policy at a time when the government needs to spend more because the economy is suffering. It's in fact able to spend less, and so it compounds some of the issues that you find across even the non-oil sector. And the reason I mention this is because, you know, in some ways, the dynamics that we're facing in the short term can be considered almost a supercharged version of what we might face in the long term. And what I mean by that is that there's both on the supply side and the demand side, things that might be true, that might turn out to be true structurally in the oil sector. In other words, on the demand side, if we're to meet our Paris obligations, if we're to meet our climate change obligations, then oil demand is going to need to peak immediately and it's going to need to fall. In our modeling for Paris compliant energy trajectories, we think that oil needs to go below 70 million barrels a day by 2040. Now, if that were to happen, if we were to live up to our Paris Agreement goals and our climate obligations, and the oil sector were to structurally change in that way, then the implications on the price would essentially mean that rather than rising in the next 20 years, they plateau. So you don't get a reversion to higher oil prices. You might see some fluctuation in the interim where, you know, supply and demand imbalances cause some volatility, but you just don't get a return to really long-term high oil prices. So rather than lower for longer, you basically get lower forever. Now, that might not be a problem if a country reacts properly. In some ways, if you look at the long-term growth trajectories of countries, it's not necessarily the long-term oil price that matters, not the absolute oil price. It's the fluctuation in the oil price that makes it very difficult for planners. And I showed that in my previous slide when it came to spending. If you don't have that predictability, it's very, very difficult to do long-term economic planning. And then your economic growth tends to be quite sclerotic. So that's the risk, the long-term structural risk for the demand side. On the supply side, there are also issues. The last price cycle in 2014, which saw that crash, was a supply side issue, not a demand side issue. And the supply side issue came from the fact that there was a real abundance of oil in the market, mostly from US shale, which had grown precipitously since 2009. And it's been growing ever since. It's been growing at an almost breathless rate. Now, this fall in prices will probably impact that. But there is also the risk on the supply side that US shale is here to stay. And if that were the case, then that would put a supply side pressure for lower oil prices. So what I'm saying is, on the demand side, you might have structural change, inefficiencies in making sure that we're using oil more efficiently and switching away from oil for certain applications. And on the supply side, you might also have an abundance of shale. And either one of these things or both these things at the same time will put a downward pressure on price. So what that means is that if you're a country like Iraq, an oil producer that relies on oil revenue to finance its budgets and to grow its economy, you're looking at a situation that is quite uncomfortable. On a per capita basis, on a per capita basis, oil revenues do not recover to the point that they reached between 2010 and 2015, even in a situation where oil demand recovers. So this isn't our Paris compliant scenario. Our normal scenario where oil demand actually increases and you get relatively high oil prices, much higher than what we have today. Oil revenue per capita does not recover to the points it reached in 2010 and 2015. If you take into consideration our Paris compliance scenario, which has a lower oil price, by 2035 and 2040, it's far lower than what it was in 2010. So the story behind this chart is that regardless of what happens to the oil price, the pressures will be building in the future. Iraq's population is one of the fastest rising in the world. We're going to have 20 million additional people between today and 2040. These people are going to need jobs. They're going to need prospects. The current model does not satisfy the need going forward. Whether you're talking about low oil prices or high oil prices, low oil demand or high oil demand, there needs to be a structural change. Oil itself will not be able to fill this gap. So that's essentially where I want to leave my comments. To give some of the energy market fundamentals that I thought would be helpful for the broader discussion. But I look forward to sharing some thoughts during the questions and answers and the exchange later on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ali, for that helpful picture of the demand supply outlook now and for the next few years. Now we're going to turn to Samia. Samia, based on your reporting, what are Iraqi officials and political parties thinking about the options on the table to deal with falling oil prices, lack of 2020 budget, and all of this, being compounded by COVID? What are you hearing in terms of how officials are planning to find additional budgetary support, or in the absence of that, to reallocate? And it'd be very helpful, and this is also based off of some questions that I'm seeing on the Q&A feed, if you could give us a sense of how different political actors and factions, as well as industry actors, are looking at these, and please include, if you could, the KRG.
Hello, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much, Iris, for holding this webinar, and of course to my fellow panelists, Ali and Ahmed, both of whom I respect a great deal. It's an honor to be in this webinar with you. Ahmed is someone I call incessantly to get his take on things, and Ali, I follow your analyses near religiously, so it's great to be here. Thank you for the question, Mac. I'm just going to scale it back a little bit before I address those questions directly, just to provide some context first. So I'm approaching this from the perspective of a journalist who covers Iraq and who endeavors to serve the public's interest. So to that end, I thought I would lay out the sort of broad themes that inform my reporting priorities at present. And of course, I'm happy to expand on that during the Q&A session. But first, I think it's important to put the various pressures on Iraq's economy in context. So in my mind, that goes back to October, at the start of the mass anti-government protests. The impact from these are often not fully considered in this present moment and in this present sort of economic crisis. Though the unrest didn't really significantly affect Iraq's main economic lifeline, which is oil. The protracted street hostilities, internet outages, blocked roads, and the general atmosphere of unease, which was later exacerbated with the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi, what this did do was set back the most fragile segment of the economy, which is the private sector. So for example, I spoke to a number of small to medium-sized businesses in Baghdad and Iraq South who were defaulting on loans, and entrepreneurs who were among a growing e-commerce sector that was near decimated. So remember that developing this sector has always been a key condition of international monetary agencies to diversify the oil-based economy and create jobs. And with every iteration of financial crisis brought on by plummeting oil prices, the private sector development issue has always come to the fore. And I suspect when it does this time, we are looking at a private sector that is arguably at its weakest. Iraqis have very little incentive at this time to take on the risks associated with entrepreneurship. And this was all exacerbated, intensified in the wake of COVID-19. Government measures to contain the spread of the virus, including a days-long curfew, prohibiting large public gatherings, led to losses in across sectors in trade, commerce, transportation, religious tourism, which was a very important source of non-oil revenue, came nearly to a halt, or entirely to a halt, actually. And also the oil sector is showing signs of impact as a result of the decrease in global demand that Ali very concisely summarized for us. So in parallel to that came the crashing oil prices. Prices were already suffering because of the pandemic before the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia brought it down further. By the end of March, we had the oil minister reportedly saying that crude was being sold at $21 a barrel. That's risen a little bit now, but it was less than half of the amount proposed in the 2020 budget. Crude is, I think, currently trading just at 27, under $30 per barrel. So considering all of that in the last few months, something my editors, I just recently joined the AP. It's my first time sort of working for a mainstream outlet. And what my editors often ask me, since we're writing for an international audience, is so why does this matter? What's the impact here? So a lot of my time is spent trying to understand those dynamics. Today, Iraq is struggling to finance measures to contain the pandemic. And if the current circumstances persist, will certainly struggle to fund state expenses amid a deepening deficit. Oil revenues in March were an indication of what might come, what is to come. The federal government earned just $2.9 billion, and that was less than what was earned back in January. And we're still waiting to see April figures. The Prime Minister's financial advisor told us that as a result of these combination of factors, Iraq stands to lose about $120 million a day, according to his estimation. The World Bank recently came out with fairly scary figures projecting that Iraq's GDP will contract by 5% in 2020 in the absence of meaningful reforms. And that the budget deficit will exceed 19% of GDP. Alarmingly, the bank has also projected that if oil prices stay in the low 30s in 2020, budget needs would reach around $60 billion. And it gets worse. Further to this, to stabilize the market, to stabilize the oil market as part of an OPEC agreement, Iraq is obligated to reduce output by 23%. So that's just over 1 million barrels a day in May and June. And this will no doubt cause financial strains until prices stabilize. So in my briefings with Iraqi officials, there is mounting concern over how the state will meet its financial responsibilities. Of particular concern is the payment of public sector salaries. And historically, this has been a massive drain on Iraq's budget. I recall quite vividly one fairly high-level official saying that payments for next month have been secured because the state is attempting to find solutions currently by sort of reducing expenses, using allocations sent elsewhere that weren't spent, freeing up money where they can, transferring this, one pot from another pot here and there for the purpose of paying salaries. They also say that foreign currency reserves, which stand at around 60 billion, I think there were 68 billion at the end of 2019, it's a bit lower now, can also be drawn upon in the absence of other options. And that's something that a lot of international agencies find somewhat alarming. Essentially, what we're seeing is the state digging into internal resources. So that's a solution that would enable the country to make ends meet on the short term, but it's really not a great long-term solution. When I confront officials with this, a common refrain that I've heard is, well, you know, we expect the oil market to move by the time we really get into hot water. So there is this, others have described as a sense of a bit of a lack of urgency at the executive level, and an optimism that eventually things will be fine. I think that is a function of what I found fairly pervasive, especially in times of political transition, is a wait and see attitude. I find that there is a reluctance to take, you know, comprehensive, strategic decisions, especially in this moment when there's a new prime minister designate, the third since Abdul Mahdi resigned in December, who will hopefully be voted in, and that will bring about much needed solutions from the executive level. That's the mentality. That's sort of what I've been hearing quite a lot. The executive leadership in place, meanwhile, has been behaving more like administrators. So at the moment, we have a high-level committee sort of issuing decrees to contain the economic fallout from COVID, for example. And that has struck some, especially officials in international circles that I've been speaking to in other circles as somewhat haphazard. And of course, there are questions over, there are unanswered questions over how even these decrees will be financed or executed. And then the combination of crises is also having an impact on the oil sector. The prevalent question there is, how will Iraq shoulder these massive cuts? Officials in SOMO, the oil marketing arm of the ministry, have said that this must happen in stages. But how and from where are big questions that are actually still being negotiated, still being discussed, as far as I know. Previous cuts were shouldered by state-run fields in the south primarily. And these are fields where basically the government has the flexibility to increase production or decrease production depending on need. But the capacity there is about 500,000 barrels a day. So what that means is cuts will come from IOC operated fields, which poses a new set of challenges because it would entail renegotiating terms, plateaus and such. You know, remember that the majority of international oil companies in Iraq operate in federal Iraq, operate based on technical service contracts. So in which they are paid a fixed fee per barrel of oil. And then they are paid back on investments to develop the field. So the age-old problem with this model, especially in Iraq, is that though it benefits the country when oil prices rise, when they drop, payments that are due to IOCs remain unchanged while government revenues continue to fall. In my conversations with IOCs, the concern is more that Iraq will be unable to reimburse them. They are more concerned about that than potential production cuts, in line with the OPEC agreement. So as I understand it, payments for the first quarter are still being discussed. And I mean, unless something has changed in the last 24 hours, they're still awaiting a resolution. And that's according to several industry sources that I've spoken to recently. And also, the ministry has not officially requested that IOCs cut production. There was a meeting a few days ago, I believe, but in terms of delivering an official letter or an official decision, that still hasn't come. And like I said, meanwhile, because of internal and international dynamics that Ali pointed out, the oil sector is starting to take a hit. Officials in SOMO have said to me that they are unsure whether crude will find buyers as a result of falling demand. And then there are reports of ships canceling or postponing loadings because of falling demand. My previous employer, Iraq Oil Report, wrote a very good story recently, shameless plug, about Iraq's largest refinery in Basra, also shutting in 2/3 of its production as a result of the drop in demand. And also, meanwhile, storage is a big problem. Storage capacity is full. So with that briefly laid out, the question foremost in my mind is what are the options on the table for Iraq in this particular time? It is unprecedented because of the absence of a budget law that would have authorized international borrowing. Until this happens, there is no real framework for international monetary agencies like the IMF to provide support. My understanding, though, is that Iraq is talking to the IMF at present. It remains also to be seen how willing international monetary agencies are to provide this kind of support given the design of the 2020 budget, which sees increased spending with little investment in non-oil streams of revenue, including the private sector. And these have always been conditions for budgetary support in the past. The 2019 budget represented a major reversal in many of the measures undertaken in the last financial crisis under Haider al-Abadi. And this led to the stoppage of the standby agreement with the IMF. So for now, what I'm seeing is Iraq sort of contemplating taking more circuitous routes to secure funding. So for example, the World Bank has offered to restructure loans that was initially meant for reconstruction in provinces liberated from the Islamic State group. And that money has basically been sitting around accumulating interest for, I think, a couple of years now. So the World Bank proposed to restructure this for COVID relief, which would then allow Iraq, free up money for Iraq to then reallocate elsewhere, potentially to the payment of salaries. But no matter how you move that kind of money around, there won't be nearly enough to satisfy state spending needs. I'm going to stop there. I know there's a lot to unpack, but I think perhaps I'll wait for the Q&A session to delve further in any of those points or anything else.
Thank you, Samia, for that very helpful picture of the political economic fallout and the options that officials have on the table, including impact on the oil sector itself. We'll turn now to Ahmed. Ahmed, you've been writing for a very long time about how the lack of investment spending on infrastructure since 2003, which Ali already kind of got into a bit, has left Iraq uniquely vulnerable to economic shocks. Could you give us a sense of how the current crisis speaks to this kind of set of structural problems? Q&A queue, I wanted to add in there any additional reflections you might have on implications for public sector, federal, Iraq, and the KRG.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mac. I'm actually, again, thrilled to be in the same panel with these wonderful people because one, Samia, I've been following your work on IOR for quite a long time and I continue to follow it all the time. And Ali, I think far from learning from me, I'm in the process of learning from you because I think some of the data that you provided is pretty excellent. A lot of it's food for thought. Now, yes, I mean, it's in a sense what I'm going to look for is first of all, just give you a quick idea of where the government is right now and what does that mean for the lack of investment spending, because that really is where my thinking that even if oil prices stayed at 100 on salaries, that we ended the government and that's really where I think overall revenues of something like $44 billion, which was called transfer because transfer prices. And these guys, something like $67 billion in for is, we might look at oil prices, the demand supply picture and how sustainable that is. But if let's say somewhere between $30 and $40. So because non-oil revenues last year were something like a quarter of them were oil related because most of them were taxes on oil companies. So let's just look at oil revenues. If you take into account OPEC cuts and if Iraq adheres to them, then what I'm looking for in terms of oil revenues, somewhere in the region of $28 to $39 billion. So that's oil price between 30 and 40. Now, if you look at what they have to do in spending, the salary component, which was 44 billion in last year, that will likely touch at least 50 billion because of the measures that the government took in October in response to the demonstrators. So what they did was our usual sort of standard policy, hire more people. And what they did was they lowered the retirement age from 65 to 60, and in order to absorb more people. But what you do in this process, you increase your retirement, your pension spending, and also you increase your salary spending, because our salary structure is not, it has an element of benefits, and the benefits are needs related as opposed to performance related. So when more young people join in, they join in with younger families and so forth. So your overall spending would be higher. So you're looking at $50 billion in spending that you cannot really get away from. And that's versus revenues of, as I said, 28 to 39 billion. So I'm assuming that they would do, again, the usual thing, which what they've announced already in terms of stopping all investment spending, asking oil companies to cut capex. I'm assuming that they're going to go over than that. If you look at all of this, you can see a deficit of something like 50 to 40 billion dollars. The World Bank's figure of 60 billion, I mean, it could be as high as 60 billion. The World Bank came in, but all depends on how much cuts they do. I'm assuming that they would do as much draconian cuts as they can. And I'm assuming also that they would, there's an amount of debt that's due to be paid, they'll postpone that. So at a best case scenario, you're looking at a deficit need between 40 billion to $50 billion. That's enormous. And if you think of how, what are the options for funding that? Well, there's really one option is to resort to debt. And to resort to debt, you had two options. One, you go to the internal market, or you go to the external market. The internal market, certainly the internal market provided something like 40 billion in debt and in financing over the last few years. But if you look at the private sector banks, they have a deposit base of something like $9 billion. They can't lend against that. Even if they could, because they're because we are a cash economy, what means the deposit base of the private banks is fairly small, but also it means that it's only almost in current account, which means that the private banks cannot lend against it for any length of time. They might need that liquidity. And that's why even when Iraq sat with the IMF in 2016, 2017, and they came up with this amazing figure that they want to raise $5 billion in domestic market every year, they hardly raise half of that amount. So what is left with what's called indirect monetary lending, i.e. The state banks will buy it and they'll be discounted by the CBI, and that will come at the expense of the reserves. If you assume full funding by that, you're talking that those reserves could come down to something like anywhere between 13 to 26 billion dollars. To put that in perspective, we're talking something like 2 to 3 months of exports. Now, I'm going to cover the idea of the valuation later, because that's where part of the magical thinking of some of our officials are. But basically, we import everything, so devaluation is never an option for a country like Iraq. But that's where it will get to. The other option is to go in and do foreign borrowing, and that certainly is possible, because one of the things about Iraq is that Iraq's debt profile actually is significantly better than what it looks on paper. I mean, I can go on details, but if somebody has an interest, but our debt profile of $110 billion is in fact nowhere near that when you actually come and look at it and dissect it. But in order for that to come, as Sami has mentioned, we need to have a government, we need to have a leadership in order to discuss that, and it has to be done by the IMF. The IMF has to lead it, because the IMF in the standby agreement, I think we lent Iraq something like $4.5 or $5.5 billion, not that much. But what the IMF does, and when it signs an agreement with Iraq, it's almost like gives a green light for other companies, for other outsiders to lend to Iraq. But given the experience that Iraq had with the IMF when Sami said the standby agreement has failed, is that we made some baby steps. I mean, we took some minute steps at 2016, 2017 in raising non-oil revenues and in imposing taxes and so forth. We reversed all of these, by the way, in 2018. Now, it all depends on what it looks like and when will they take action. From everything I've seen so far from the government and the political class, is that this is not really an issue yet in their mind. So what I would see is that they would actually carry on cutting everything. And as Samia said, hope that by the time that they come through this, that they will be bailed out by oil prices. But if they don't, and if they delay and so forth, that means these cuts that we have to do are going to be draconian, and they're going to be done in a much condensed period of time. Almost like, I mean, the closest something one can look at is what happened in Greece, in the sense of the amount of damage that needs to be done. Because what you end up by doing is you end up by increasing non-oil revenues through taxes, through consumption taxes like VAT, through taxes on goods and services, as well as taxes on income. And you have to unravel all the things that build our social state. So subsidies on oil, subsidies on energy, like energy products and refined products, as well as subsidies on gas and subsidies on electricity. All of these can be done, but in a short period of time, it'll be very difficult. But to see really the impact of that on Iraq's private sector, it's actually quite important to look at Iraq's private sector in a way, what it's like. Our private sector, in a way, everybody knows is fairly small. But if you want to look at it, our private sector, it's divided basically to the informal sector, which is very large, and the formal sector. The formal sector accounts for something like 33% of overall GDP, or I mean, I'm using 2018 figures, and it accounts for 60% of non-oil GDP. That looks fairly impressive, but if you take away something like telecommunication, which is a third of that, you're left with about 40%. And that's divided into small industries. I mean, like it's mostly into transportation, into trade, into building and construction, and agriculture. But if you look at the really productive part of our economy, it's basically agriculture. That accounts for 4.5% of non-oil GDP. And our manufacturing is even smaller than that, at 3.5% of non-oil GDP. And that's like absolutely zip. Now, if you want to see what is the size of the informal economy, and that's really where the economy, I think every one of us who lives in Iraq sees, because all of that is the informal economy. It's basically informal economy is defined as all the economy that's outside the state's control, outside the tax net and outside the government's regulatory net as well. Now that one, how big it is, it's a very, very difficult question. But if I use various estimates that the world has on MENA size of the informal market, I would say it's pretty much at least as big as the formal private sector. And if you think of it, where is that informal economy, and where is that concentrated? Because it really matters to the October demonstrations. It's divided basically into the rural private sector, informal sector, which is mostly agriculture and animal husbandry and basic dairy foods. And then you have the city one, and that's really where the pressures we have. And that is mostly concentrated in trade. All of that is pretty much in trade, and most of it is in street vending trade. So in a sense, everything that happened, disrupt activities in October all the way to December from demonstrations, was hit by that sector, which is the biggest one. And it will be hit now by the COVID lockdown. But that's not really about all of it, because if you look at over all of this private sector, you look at what's called the informal employment. Because even though we have a formal sector, a lot of the formal sector hires employees informally, because our labor laws are extremely complicated and they are very difficult and so forth. So most of them go into agreeing with people, either contracts or basically anything that's outside that. So if you look at how big that is, and that's really where the pressures on the whole country come in. If you look at Iraq's working population, it's difficult to estimate, but rough estimates would be something like 10 million people would probably be active in some sort of employment or another. Of those, there's about 4 million who work for the government. That leaves 6. Where are they? If you believe the surveys that were done 6-7 years ago, almost all of them are in the informal sector. But I'm guessing at least a third of them now are formal. So you're looking at 4 million people that are working in the informal sector that are actually the most vulnerable of all. And when you work in the informal sector, that tends to be mostly skewed towards young. So the younger part of the population are the ones who predominate that informal sector. And if that's not enough, I think Ali mentioned we are a very young population. That 4 million people, which could be as high as 5, but let's say 4, that one is growing by 500,000 every year as more and more people join the workforce. And now this is the part that is actually, that cannot be absorbed in the public sector, that cannot be taken into other employment. And the reason why we have, and I think finally I'm answering your question, Mac, the reason why we have a very small overall private sector is that one, historic, in the sense that the state used to dominate all economic activities and now still dominates everything that's very large. And you look at basically oil, gas, electricity there. But one of the sub-reasons is what I wrote before and talked about a lot, in the sense of the structural imbalance of our budget, where almost all spending goes towards public sector employee spending. Now that one has grown almost 5-fold from 2005. 2005, the figure was about $10 billion. In 2004, actually 2004 was a wrong analogy, but just to give you a figure, 2004, that figure was under $5 billion. But in 2005, they've adjusted salaries to make up for the years of underspending. But it's up 5-fold in that time. But in the same time, there has been no spending whatsoever on infrastructure. And our infrastructure, by the way, it's not like that we desperately need it, but that infrastructure is not there. It's been destroyed by 4 decades of conflict. Those of us who took part in the Kuwait Conference for Reconstruction, and if you know that $88 billion, that $88 billion, by the way, is to repair the damage done to whatever survives during the ISIS crisis. So we're talking everything that survived until 2014. The damage to that part was about $46 billion. That's one of the reasons we don't have a private sector that can supply that. Other reasons are very important. One of them is we don't have a rule of law. Without a rule of law, there is no private sector, because any private sector business, normally what it has, you have to have, you have contracts, you have debts, you have liabilities, the enforcement of that. Without that, you don't have any private sector, which is why anybody who looks at us and every other conflict economy, what they basically see, they see activities like we have malls, we have coffee shops, we have restaurants, we have all of these things, but all of these things are quick payback things. We don't have anything where people spend a large amount of money in, i.e. building infrastructure. That's why our manufacturing is so tiny at only 3.5% of GDP. I'll just finish this in the day. And finally, we have is the lack of funding for these enterprises. All of this stuff puts together. So where is the government right now? The issue right now is if you have to meet your salaries, you've got to do dramatic cuts. These dramatic cuts, what do? They make life substantially worse for the informal economy and for the private sector. If you take care of the private sector, i.e. like what other governments are doing, i.e. what's doing counter-cyclical, then it's gonna come at the expense of salaries. So that's where the dilemma is. And I think with that happy thought, I might have used up my time and more of that. So I'll leave it to the Q&A. But if I may, can I ask first the Q&A? Can I start that?
Yeah, we're going to move to a few questions among and between our panelists, and we will start with Ahmed. Go ahead.
Well, basically, I'm going to go a question which can be answered by both Ali and Samia, and that basically, Ali, the picture you gave on the supply demand and the expectations of the demand overtaking supply at year end and possibly next year depends on 2 crucial assumptions. One assumption is you have oil demand recovering because we're going to go back to some sort of normal, and we have no idea what that normal is. But let's leave that aside. Part of the thing is supply would be disappear from the market. Now, most of the focus is on shale oil supply disappearing or other non-OPEC supply disappearing. But my question really is a thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and that's basically after this, assuming there is some sort of recovery to world demand, the GCC and Iraq, in a way, we're all sitting on stranded assets. So they might very well have every interest down the line, especially if you believe your scenario of declining oil demand, is that they have every incentive to get that stranded asset out, and therefore they will act as a pressure on demand, and therefore price will be low. So the question is, Ali, how realistic is that question of mine? And Samia, in discussions with or questions when you ask our government are they aware of any of these things beyond the immediate putting out fires.
Should we take them in order? Would you prefer?
Go ahead.
It's an excellent question, Ahmed. It's basically, it falls into two categories as I understand it. First is, will there be a structural shift in demand? And second of all, how will producers who have their own agency, they're not just sitting back and being inactive participants in this market, how will they react to changing realities going forward, be they for the reasons of climate change or others? The first is that honestly, the recovery, the shape of the recovery right now is anybody's guess. They go beyond the energy market, they go to the global economy, they go into global pandemics that none of us really have any good empirical data on at the moment. But the assumption that I showed, and I did kind of caveat it with the notion that it is an assumption, is quite a strong V-shaped recovery by the end of the year. And that being seen, yes, there is a recovery of demand, but not enough to wipe out the destruction that happened in the first quarter of this year. That said, and this is something we're studying, this is in some ways the largest social experiment globally that may have ever been done over the last century, in the sense that now 4 billion of us, or 3.5 to 4 billion of us, are sitting at home, working differently, shopping differently, doing what we used to do in different ways. So will there be modal shifts that change the way we consume energy? That's something we're trying to study. It's still early days, but it's a question, again, on the demand side. Now, regarding how producers react, what you said is actually very true. And it calls into question, I can't really speculate too much, but it does call into question, what is the appropriate producer strategy? There have been questions asked whether some of the more affluent producers, some of the more established producers, will go to a point where rather than try to maintain a price level, they'll try to maintain market share. So to say, we need to make sure that we are the strongest a producer on this market, and the price is quite relevant. We want to capture the largest market share. So to make up in volume some of what you lose in price, but to make sure that you're there strong. Now, there are certain things that need to happen for you to be competitive in such a market. First is that you have to be a low-cost producer, which Iraq is. It's a low-cost producer. But two other things which Iraq is not so competitive on, but which would stand it in good stead in a global oil market going forward that is more resilient if you need it to go that way, is that even in our SDS, which is our Paris compliant scenario, there's 70 million barrels of oil. So that's needed by 2040 per year. So you need to make sure that you're cost competitive, but you also need to make sure that the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of your oil production is some of the most competitive in the world. And because we flare a lot of gas in Iraq, because there are methane leakages, we don't perform so well on that metric. So if these things start to get priced in by the consumer, Iraq doesn't perform so well. The other thing is, you are only able to pursue such a strategy aggressively if you have non-oil sources of revenue, or you can rely on non-oil sources of revenue. Iraq cannot do that. Iraq, as we have all basically been trying to describe for the last hour or so, is wholly reliant on what happens with the oil price. And so it's not, just by virtue of it having a low cost base, it can be competitive going forward, but certain things need to change for it to be able to take up the strategy that Ahmed spoke about. Now, I wanted to comment on a couple of things that Ahmed mentioned, and also that Samia mentioned. But while I'm already speaking, if I was an Iraqi policymaker, or if I was advising Iraqi policymakers, my whole narrative would be based on hoping for the best but planning for the worst. It's not enough for an Iraqi policymaker or a policymaker in a country like Iraq, where all of your eggs are in one basket and where you have very little control over that basket, to say, hopefully oil prices recover. Yes, there are parts of it that are going to be outside of your control. There are parts of policy making worldwide that are going to be outside of the realm of your control, but not this. I mean, this is huge. This is the entire economic well-being of the country relies on it. It's not enough to rely on the good graces of the global market to say whether you can or cannot pay your bills. Again, hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That's the mantra I think they should all be following.
Samia, did you want to add?
Yeah, just to answer Ahmed's question, is there, this is demand and restructuring on the radar? The focus, as far as my conversations with and briefings with officials is concerned, is on we have a economic crisis, a severe financial crisis. We have two options. Either we can cut spending or borrow. How will we do that? That seems to be at the forefront of their thinking and of their attention, or that is what is capturing their attention at the moment. And also the different political factions are also very much focused on previous to a few weeks ago, who would be the next prime minister. So a lot of negotiations were ongoing, and that seemed to have sort of monopolized their energies and also their interests. So in my conversations at that level, it has never gone to that point. And I don't really see that kind of long-term thinking right now, but as Ali mentioned, it's also early days. However, when you speak to sort of director generals at the, in SOMO or in other sort of technical departments, they are fearful is not the right word, but that is something that they bring up in conversation, as a possibility and as an uncertainty. But that's sort of where that conversation stops. It doesn't really go beyond that. So it is on the minds of some technocrats for sure.
Thanks, Samia. And Ali, did you have a question for any of the panelists?
Yes, it's a bit of a speculative one, but for either Samia or for Ahmed. One of my questions was, in this time when we're going to have a constrained capital expenditure budget, where do you assess the energy sector priorities will be? Now, obviously, the oil upstream is the part of the equation that brings in most of the revenue, but there are other plans that Iraq has that are quite important to its development. We spoke about the private sector. Ahmed mentioned the importance of the private sector. One of the enablers of that private sector would be electricity, stable electricity. Do you have any reading of what this kind of depressed environment will do to capital expenditure and projects on the electricity side and on gas capture, because that's a really important issue for economic reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons?
So, Samia, you want to start?
Sure. So, I mean, for the energy sector, just on that it will probably have on just on oil. One measure that was taken was to cut spending by 30%. That was a request made by the oil ministry to IOCs. Does not affect production, in any way. In some conversations with IOC officials, they have raised the concern that, well, if you're not investing in certain projects, I mean, what they're concerned about is that there isn't a solid understanding that down the line this will result in a drop in production if you're not, doing water injections, if you're not drilling new wells, if you're not looking into new technologies, if you don't have new projects. Ultimately, this will be the result, depending on how long this situation persists. So that is still a very real effect that this could have on so that occurred. And now, I mean, all of that is sort of alternative sources of gas holds an estimated. Diala is another pretty major. However, the project U.S. sanctions that the vacuum in these back, and I'm not.
Samia Ahmed.
Well, to Sami answer again, the electricity sector needs a year ago and others and so forth. It needs a significant of the spectrum system, our current support for them. The only way, I mean, this crisis in a sense, if anything, because we don't show contracts in which I think somebody mentioned to the IEA, you guys have done a very interesting number. Pay for generators is something like to pay the government. What we need to do is rational, no matter what amount of money you throw at, if we change our tariff structure, if we, the numbers which any of Iraq's area needs, because, so,
that we've actually been working with, I was last there in September, to negotiate appeared back then, which is a different world to tariff reform. It's like you say, I mean, obviously to pay an implicit subsidy of something like 12 billion, it's a double whammy, but in terms of population growth. So one of the areas that we were trying to price signal to incentivize the more rational. So just to kind of say, okay, you don't really need to use all of the ACs when you do have the electricity because you're going to be charged for that. That helps. But I completely agree with every other thing that you said. One of the major issues is the fact that a lot of the revenue in Iraq at the moment is being captured by private neighborhood generators and not by the state grid. And that just it sets up a whole list of perverse incentives that means that you can't invest in the parts of the system that are going to actually bring you secure electricity. And it puts more money and more power into the hands of the people that run these private generators.
Thanks, Ali. And Samia, did you have a question for either of the panelists?
Yes, I have a question. I have a question for Ahmed, actually. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether you think the China deal might help with investment spending.
Yes, the China, right? The China, I think this is in a case of actually, it's a case of much ado about nothing. In the sense, yes, it's a significant deal. Yes, it's a meaningful one. Yes, it's the right one. But to put it in context, you're talking of $10 billion over 20 years. So you're talking $500 million a year. And the discussions in Iraq seem to have gone completely, I think, perverse, either from the idea that, oh, this is the reason why the US is conspiring against the government, all the way into magical thinking by members of parliament and or by members of the, let's say, the committee on economics and stuff, in the sense of, oh, we don't need to invest in capex. The China deal will do it for us. I mean, end of the day, you're talking, as I said, $10 billion over 20 years. I mean, yes, it's a nice one. Yes, we should do a lot more than those, but 10 billion over that, just the idea, to put it in comparison to how much we need just to repair the ISIS damage of 88 billion. And we need that kind of thing within 5 years, not 10 billion. So yes, it's a positive one, but the magical thinking internally is that, wow, this will help us. It will help us, but it'll be so tiny. It's just neither here nor there.
Ahmed, and we'll turn now to questions coming in from the queue, and panelists you can also take a look at them if
I can see questions on debt.
But I want to ask you, Ahmed, because there's a few people who have mentioned this. Could you follow up a bit on the debt profile aspect? And then also there's been a number of people asking about the KRG. To what extent the KRG will have to share in these kind of OPEC cuts, and then the implications for budgetary spending in the KRG.
Okay, so on the debt one, that's the fairly easy one. It's based on the work I've done a couple of years ago. But roughly right now, if you look at Iraq's debt, it's somewhere like $110 billion. It was like, I think, 120 billion at the end of 2018. It's probably declined by a bit if my reading of the central bank figures are correct. But 110 billion might look large in terms of a GDP, especially right now, if our GDP is going to be or nominal GDP is going to be rated much lower given the drop in oil prices. But if you look at that, $110 billion, if you look at it really, that's made up of two chunks. One chunk is internal debt of $40 billion, something like that right now. That foreign debt, that local debt is mostly by the government, for the government. So basically, it's debt ultimately held by the CBI, sorry, and that debt rolls over every year. So that's not an issue for them as far as renewing it. And the effective interest rate on that is somewhere under 3%. The other foreign debt, which looks very large, again, that you're talking $70 billion of foreign debt. But of that, something like $41 billion is loans that Iraq had incurred with the GCC during the Iran-Iraq war. Those loans sit on the books, but the GCC is not asking for payments. They're not accruing interest, and neither we're making anything on them. So they just sit there on that. From that, an additional that $6 billion is held by the Paris Club, which after they did a 90% haircut. So that again is extremely friendly debt and stretched out almost forever. Then you're left with $20 billion that roughly was built up over the course of the ISIS crisis of 2014, 2015, and 2016 onwards. And all of that is with bilateral parties. And all of it, if you add it all up, that has a effective interest rates of, again, under 3%, and is on extremely generous terms on repayment and so forth. So Iraq's only commercial debt, really, if you look at it in a sense of proper commercial debt, is $4.7 billion in Eurobonds. And of those, there's $1 billion, which is guaranteed by the US government. And we pay, I think, 1% on that. So yes, if you look at the figure, it's large, but in terms of the debt payments that comes as a result of that, they're neither here nor there in terms of overall. And if Iraq succeed in making a deal with the GCC along the Paris Club, then you remove something like $37 billion out of that. So that's why I say it looks better. Rating agencies are all aware of what I'm saying, so none of this is a surprise to them. But nobody will change that, neither would the IMF. One, because they need a deal with the GCC countries, but more importantly, Iraq has to be upfront with its own finances, has to be clear with the outside world how it structures its debt and so forth. So that's on the debt. If you come to the KRG, that's actually is going to be even sort of trickier in the sense because there's not much data available. So I base it on my work, which is based on the Deloitte audits of the KRG's oil exports as of 2018. If I try to extrapolate those going into forward, which is like there's a lot of uncertainty there, but at least I know I got the dynamics right, if not the details right. If you look at it, the KRG under the 2019 budget gets from the Iraq government annually $4.6 billion. Under my estimate, it nets something like $3.5 billion in 2019 from oil exports of roughly about 425,000. So altogether, you look at 8.1 billion, but they have salary obligations of 8.9 billion. Now, if they do the cuts in line with Iraq, and whether they, I think just like Iraq overall, whether we like to do them or not, we're going to do them anyways, because nobody would want that oil and there is no storage. So the cuts are going to become, at least in April and May and June, they're going to be inevitable because there's no storage worldwide for them. So we will cut whether we dress it up as we're complying with the OPEC plus or we're not. If you look at all of this, and if you assume for the year, you're looking at that $3.5 billion in revenues comes down to between 1.5 to 2 billion. And if you add to the 4.6 billion from the government, that does not cover anywhere near the 8.9 billion in salaries, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's spurring the whole idea that the KRG and the central government, and in fact, this is the only good thing to happen from that crisis, that they've begun to have proper constructive talks in the sense of they're linking it with developing the KRG's gas field. So if that was to happen, and the KRG would send its oil through the federal government as is being discussed, then that picture looks substantially better for them, at least in terms of being in the same boat as Iraq, because unlike the federal government, the KRG has got no reserves to fall back onto. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. We have a number of other questions that are coming through, and I'll just turn to Ali. One question is specifically directed to you. It says, as demand has collapsed, oil producers now have to battle for market share. Last week, KSA offered interest-free loans to refiners to take Saudi crude. Does Iraq have any hope at all in terms of competing for market share against other producers with deeper pockets?
Question, and I think it does. I mean, again, by virtue of the fact that it is a low-cost producer, that it is geographically well located, that it has existing long-term commercial kind of agreements with a number of the largest producers. And also because if you look at the kind of the type of oils that Iraq can ship, it can meet quite a lot of different refiners' needs. Now, at present, they are doing, and SOMO has proven quite adept at selling Iraq's oil and are getting better and better at doing so. Now, if you look at where the demand has really diminished the most, it's motor gasoline. Motor gasoline, because people aren't driving so much. Diesel's held up quite strongly because of the fact that, you know, you still need trucking, you need logistics. But motor gasoline has taken a hit. And that usually is on the lighter side of the oil that you need. So Iraq, being a medium and heavy producer, it means that it can still ship to refineries in India and China quite competitively. So yes, you know, they're going to have more work to do. It's an increasingly competitive market, but that's not where my primary concern is for a country like Iraq. My primary concern is more macroeconomic. And what I mean by that is everything we've spoken about today is making enough money to pay salaries. That is a really, really low target. I mean, that's staying solvent at the most basic level. We're not talking about anything else. And Iraq is not a country, I'm diverging here a little bit, but Iraq is not a country that has the luxury of being able to sit still. It's going to need to sprint like hell just to make up for the lost time of decades of war and sanctions and unrest have kind of reaped on the infrastructure and on broader development. So what I'm saying here is that yes, you know, even if it meets payroll this year and it can meet payroll next year, if there are no capital expenditure budgets to fix the stuff that Ahmed was talking about, the $88 billion worth of damage caused by ISIS, the fact that 1/5 of the network was, or the electricity network was destroyed by ISIS, et cetera, that doesn't even bring it up to a regional standard. That brings it, you know, the regional standard is still quite significantly ahead of that. And so you're looking at that next tranche that allows Iraq to start to converge with the regional standard, because by all measurements, it's not there. And so what I'm saying in a roundabout way is meeting salaries shouldn't be the be all and end all. And if the government can't dedicate the capital resources to be able to invest, then maybe it's a time to start thinking about, you know, systematically, where is it, how is it that the economy can be restructured to bring in the kinds of investment? Maybe we need to start thinking about ways to liberalize the economy, to bring in foreign or other private investments. Because if these are our choices, if the choice is choice A, there is no investment, or choice B, we have to look at something else, then that might be the lesser of the two evils. And I'm not sure that waiting for the oil price to recover is necessarily going to be a third choice. That's we don't know if it is. So I don't know what that new system would look like, but it just appears to me to be something that's just intuitive. If something is not working and you've got no prospect of making it work, then maybe you have to think about alternatives. And maybe that alternative is that if the government can't pay up for the capital budget, then it needs to look at other, or incentivize other forms of investment.
Thanks, Ali. And this is a question for Samia. There's a question that basically says, let's wind it forward a few months. What happens if the government simply makes no decisions? That is, they continue to pay salaries and don't make any moves on subsidies, and the oil price hovers around $30. What is the political and economic impact of such a non-strategy? Samia, you'll need to unmute yourself.
You know, I was scared that I was going to do that, and I ended up doing that. So great. I think if this status quo persists, there's no leadership, oil prices are still low in the next couple months, you will see Iraq struggling to pay, you know, if digging into internal resources, you know, once you use up that, you'll see Iraq digging into foreign currency reserves, struggling to pay public sector salaries, you know, and potentially, you know, more unrest on the street. We have seen the anti-government protests have sort of been dying down, and that's largely a result, I mean, sort of the turnout on the streets were dwindling before the pandemic, but measures to sort of stem the spread of coronavirus has all but, you know, there are still people on the street, but in tents, but there are no rallies, no marches. So that could erupt again, potentially, depending on how frustrated people are, especially if public sector workers aren't getting paid. And then you might also see, you know, further down the line, public sector jobs has always been a foolproof way of, you know, different political actors, parties to maintain loyalties. That has, you know, that's part of the reason why it's such a bloated sector, and why it's such a drain on the budget. If you are unable to maintain those patronage networks, they will start to unravel. So that's also something that we might see further down the line. Yeah, more doom and gloom, I'm afraid.
Well, we're going to close with just one final question to all three panelists, if you could kind of treat these as your closing remarks. And Ali already started to do this in his opening statement. What does this mean for policymakers in both Baghdad and internationally? What are some frameworks going forward that can be useful to think through these complex challenges? We'll just start with Samia.
Sorry, Matt, can you repeat that question? I just had a little glitch with my connection. Apologies for that.
No worries. Basically, just building off of what Ali was doing earlier, which was to say, kind of think about this concretely in terms of what would an Iraqi policymaker do? And just broadly speaking, what are some ways in which policymakers can think through these questions in terms of concrete ways forward over the next months and weeks?
I think that there definitely needs to be some kind of fresh way of thinking about what Iraq should do when oil prices fall, because this is not the first time that a crisis like this has come to Iraq, though it's possibly, it's never been this bad before. So every time this happens, there is a renewed urgency to sort of rethink the way things are done. And we saw this in the previous financial crisis. Austerity measures were introduced, reform measures were introduced. There was an economic reform unit in the Prime Minister's office overseeing this, but it sort of the engine behind that sort of died down with Adel Abdel Mahdi's administration, and the political incentive sort of went away. So sometimes I think in Iraq, times of crisis is a moment to think about innovative strategies, ways of dealing with things. But the main element, the most important factor that can see that through is the political will to do that. So that's I think always been an issue, and that will continue to be an issue. We have heard countless international watchers, international agencies recommend that Iraq find ways to diversify the economy. Like Ali said, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, you're in deep trouble when something like this happens. So I think that there definitely needs to be a new way of thinking about the problem. I I'm not entirely sure what that is though, but I would look to analysts like Ali or Ahmed to kind of think outside the box on that.
So Ahmed?
Well, I would look to analysts like Ali and the IMF as well, but but the way I would answer it is that this fresh way of thinking, by the way, is not new. Iraq does not lack this fresh way of thinking. Over the last 10 years or so, if you look at the various reports that the IMF has issued with Iraq, the various consultations they gave to Iraq, IMF, World Bank, IEA, none of what we're saying is news. They have known that, they have understood it, and it's been there. It's collecting, most of the time, collecting virtual dust in PDF reports and so forth. So the question comes in to the policymaker, why? I think in a way, not like what can we tell them, but why doesn't it work? And part of my thinking is that every government we had after 2003 is a consensus government, which basically means is that, yes, if they think there should be something to be done, i.e. reform, then it should be done by the other parties, not by my party. And I think this is at the root of it, because you cannot take a decision. Right now, you're seeing magical decisions. And in saying this, I'm going to partly answer the thing on the foreign exchange. One of the things that they're coming up with is, if you hear discussions, let's devalue the currency. Well, devalue the currency, for example, would work if we were producing something other than oil. Our oil is priced in dollars, so it will not benefit from devaluing the currency. We don't make anything internally here, as I said, fairly small, which means that devaluing the currency ultimately means the cost that we import every food will go up, i.e. cost of living will go up, i.e. living standards will go down. So ultimately my answer is that we need to have a fresh way of looking at how our consensus governments are formed, because as long as we have that kind of structure, there will not be a decision taken, because who will take a decision? Who will take it? They'll all agree on it, but who will implement it? Who will sacrifice their prized possessions in a way? That's ultimately the challenge I think we have, and that's the question we need to ask. Because none of the solutions are new. They're all there. You read them and you go, 2014, 2009, 2018. They're all there, and all we're doing is I'm reading them and reiterating them outside. So with that, I end.
Thank you, Ahmed. Ali?
Thank you very much, Mac. If these are my concluding statements, then I'd like to thank you and the Institute once again for inviting me to comment on these issues. Now, the policy environment you speak of, the Iraq's policy constraints are not unique to Iraq. If you look at oil-dependent economies region-wide, they face very similar issues. And Ahmed spoke about policy documents from 10 years ago. The first National Development Plan of Saudi Arabia, you can go onto the Ministry of Planning website, they have every single one, was published in 1970. And the very first point they make is that they need to diversify their revenues away from oil. It's a hard thing to do, but it's necessary. And it's always been known that you need to do this. Now, the problem with it, it's an inherent issue that seems to be kind of, to permeate throughout whatever producer you're talking about. And it's one of incentives. At the time when when oil prices are high and the pressure is off, that's when you have the means to diversify. But when oil prices dip, you're thinking about diversifying your revenue because you're immediately feeling the pinch, but you don't have the means to do it. So that cycle needs to break. Policymakers in Iraq need to make sure that they're actively thinking not to kick the can down the road, and for when they have the means to think longer term, to be able to put the kinds of policies in place that will turn their currently pro-cyclical policies anti-cyclical. So to say, maybe save up for a rainy day fund, maybe think about opening up the sector when everybody's looking to get into Iraq because the oil prices are high. Think like this, where it breaks that cycle, rather than if the oil prices go up, you think, okay, this is my time to take another 3 million people onto the public payroll. Don't do that, and start farming out parts of the state to people who can take it out, who can make a good job of it, and enact some of these counter-cyclical policies that haven't been a feature of Iraqi governance for a very long time. Now, I'd like to basically end by just saying you cannot hope your way out of this. You can't wish your way out of this. This is a situation that's going to require very uncomfortable decisions. But that's why people get in, why I hope people would be getting into politics in the first place. You know, they're leaders for a reason. They're supposed to lead through difficult times. And these are difficult times. So this is where, you know, this is where real leaders earn their stripes. If the difficult decisions can be taken and can be communicated to the people so that they can get the buy-in, then that will be a sign of political success. And I go back to what Ahmed was saying. Ahmed was saying, you know, political consensus and the fact that the formations of the government are basically making it difficult for any really substantive reform to be enacted. That's true. But there are other instances internationally where very fractious governments have been able to do things and enact very, very significant reforms. In Mexico, they came together for a pact. They called it the Pact for Mexico. It was outside of government. It was all the main parties. And they took on education reform, telecoms reform, and the energy sector reform. So they took on Pemex, which had had a monopoly for decades. They took on Carlos Slim, basically, or, you know, these are the vested interests they took on. And they did it because the politicians came together and decided that this was what they wanted to do. Now, I'm not saying that Iraq should necessarily follow in Mexico's footsteps altogether or whatever, but just to call it a day before you even started is you're going to work in the confines that you have, and you have to think of a way to make it happen. So yes, essentially just try to change the way things have been done. No more short-termism. Think about things down the road, because it's not even that far down the road where we could be in significant trouble.
Well, thank you very much, Ali, and thank you to all of our panelists. As Samia alluded to at the beginning, the stakes of this are very high. Ordinary Iraqis are already feeling the pinch in many ways. And that is why at IRIS, we're going to continue to have webinars and conversations on Iraq's political and economic outlook going forward. Thank you again as well to our AUIS and IRIS staff for all the hard work that you put into putting on this webinar. All right, we'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening in.
Thanks, guys.